He didn't run a red light. He didn't react late. But simply because he was a man of color behind the wheel of a BMW, the officer, Brent Halverson, pressed a gun to his chest and pulled the trigger without hesitation. Blood soaked his white shirt, yet the officer's eyes remained cold and wide, as if he'd just taken out the trash. Not a single apology, not even a flicker of conscience. But what he didn't know was that the woman sitting next to the victim wasn't just any widow. She was a former operative of Ghost 6, a top-secret Delta Force unit. How many other routine mistakes would be exposed if this victim decided not to stay down? Keep watching to see just how high the price of brutality can be. The night was supposed to end with applause and laughter. Camille sat in the passenger seat of their gleaming BMW, a quiet hum beneath her feet as her husband steered them out of the school parking lot. The air smelled faintly of spring, but the tension hadn't left her chest since the curtain closed. Her fingers rested on the leather trim of her bag, unconsciously tracing the curve of the zipper. Her husband was saying something about how well the kids performed, how their daughter had played the cello like a pro, but Camille's gaze stayed locked ahead, scanning the quiet suburban street like a reflex. They had barely crossed the second block when the patrol lights flared behind them, blue and red bleeding into the night, flashing across the windshield like an unwanted memory. Her husband sighed, pulled over with the kind of measured calm that only people of color in America learn through years of practice. Camille's hand didn't move, but her breath slowed deliberately, like preparing for a dive. Two officers approached, one with a clipped walk, the other dragging his steps like the weight of the badge didn't quite sit right. The first man reached the driver's side window, tapping the glass with a knuckle as sharp as his expression. Brent Halverson. Camille knew his face before she saw his name. She'd seen that brand of contempt before, on borders, in dust-stained uniforms, through cracked lenses in places where empathy didn't survive past boot camp. Brent said nothing at first. His eyes flicked from the car's polished exterior to Camille's face, then to her husband's hand resting on the steering wheel. His mouth curled, not quite a sneer, but not neutral either. The pause stretched, thick and deliberate. "Evening, officers," her husband offered with a quiet, practiced courtesy. Brent didn't respond. Wallace Kim, the second officer, stepped up to the passenger side and gave a polite nod, an awkward attempt at civility. "License and registration, please?" he asked, voice calm but eyes unsettled. As her husband leaned toward the glove compartment, Camille clocked the way Brent's fingers twitched near his holster. Not drawing, but not resting easily. His voice sliced through the air like a razor, aimed not at procedure, but at provocation. "Nice car," Brent said flatly. "Didn't know school concerts paid that well." Camille didn't answer. Her husband smiled politely, beginning to reach for the documents. Brent leaned closer. "You two look familiar." Wallace shot him a glance, cautious, hesitant, but said nothing. Brent's eyes narrowed, sharp and unblinking. "You," he said, eyes now locked on Camille. "Didn't you serve somewhere sandy, right? What was it? Intel? Logistics?" His tone dripped with mock memory, but the edge underneath was serrated. Camille looked straight ahead. Her posture didn't shift, but her hand slipped beneath her coat, fingers coiling tight around the zipper of her bag like a noose. Her eyes were calm, cold, utterly still, as if daring the world to blink first. "No comment?" Brent prodded. "Come on. A lady like you must have stories." Wallace coughed lightly. "Brent, don't interrupt me," Brent snapped. "She's got the eyes. You see it too, right? That stare? Like she's seen things, or done 'em." Her husband tried again, softer this time. "Sir, I have the paperwork here if you'd just—" "Hands where I can see 'em!" Brent barked suddenly, hand flying to his weapon. His voice cracked across the car like thunder. "Don't reach for anything." Camille's breath hitched, eyes flaring for a split second, not in fear, but in calculation. Wallace stepped forward, palm half raised, face tense. "Let's keep it cool. They're cooperating." Brent ignored him, still fixated on Camille, as if her silence itself was an affront. "I don't like liars. or ghosts, so tell me, what exactly were you doing before you got yourself a front row seat in a suburban parade? Camille turned her head slowly, not because she was commanded to, but because she chose to. Her eyes met Brent's with a stare that did not flinch, did not explain, and did not soften. Nothing about her expression asked for mercy. Nothing about her presence hinted at guilt. Brent stepped back half a pace but recovered quickly, masking the moment with a sniff and a tilt of the head. "This one," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Wallace to hear. "She thinks she's better than this. Better than us." Wallace didn't respond. His eyes darted to Camille, then to Brent, calculating how long this moment could hold before it snapped. Inside the car, Camille's grip on the zipper never loosened. Not in fear, not for escape, just readiness. The silence returned, but it wasn't calm. It was the kind of silence that buzzed in the bones, the kind that always came before something terrible. Camille watched Brent from the edge of her periphery, not because she feared him, but because she already knew what kind of man he was, the kind that mistook stillness for submission, the kind that cracked when faced with someone who didn't flinch. Brent exhaled sharply, as if trying to burn off whatever shame had just crawled up his spine. His voice, when it returned, was quieter, but no less venomous. "Let's wrap this up, Wallace. I've had enough of the silent treatment." Wallace glanced again at Camille's face. Something there unsettled him. It wasn't rage. It wasn't fear. It was something worse. A stillness that did not care whether he approved, feared, or pitied. It was the stillness of someone who had buried too many bodies to care about bruised egos. He looked away. Brent clicked his tongue, stepping back. "Right, let's move on. Nothing but attitude tonight." But as he walked away, the words tumbled out before he could stop them. Bitter and impotent. Should have stayed in uniform. At least over there people know their place. Camille didn't react. Not outwardly, but under the coat. Her grip tightened once, briefly, then released. It was not the time. Not yet. But he had already lost. Not because she had spoken, but because she hadn't. And that was something Brent Halverson would not forget. Silence can stretch like a fault line just before it fractures. The air still tasted of halogen and disdain when her husband leaned, slowly, carefully, toward the glove compartment. His movements were methodical, almost rehearsed, like a man who had practiced what to do under pressure, not in combat but under sirens. His fingertips barely touched the tab on the leather wallet when Brent's voice cracked the night like a whip. "Don't reach out of the car, hands on your head," Brent shouted with the kind of panic that only masqueraded as command. It was not controlled. It was a man drowning in his authority, flailing behind a badge and a gun. The shift from suspicion to chaos happened in less than a breath. Wallace's voice cut in, tense but not yet broken. "Brent, calm down. It's not," but the warning came too late. There was no pause for a reason, no room for judgment. Just noise and motion and the hiss of a safety clicking off. The shot fired like a hammer splitting bone, not thunderous, just sharp, clean, final. The echo chased itself down the street as though embarrassed to have arrived. The bullet carved through the air and punched into flesh, right through the center of her husband's chest, flattening time in an instant. His body jerked backward with the crude choreography of violence, not collapse, like a string cut wrong. Camille didn't scream. She didn't gasp. She didn't even blink. Her door flew open before anyone else could move. She was out of the car and on the ground in a single motion, catching his body as it tilted toward the asphalt. His blood came hot and fast, soaking through the crisp white of his shirt, then her dress, until the fabric clung like guilt. She cradled him, one arm behind his neck, the other pressing flat to his chest, but the blood ignored her, eager to leave. His eyes were open, unfocused. His lips tried to form her name, but the only sound he made was a wet rasp, barely more than breath. She leaned close, her voice low, fierce, unwavering. I've got you, baby." But he was slipping fast, and his body no longer obeyed its weight. His hand, once steady on her waist during slower dances, now spasmed against her thigh. Fingers twitching, seeking something they would never find again. She took that hand and held it tight, but it shook anyway, like it had a mind of its own, terrified and fading. Brent took a step forward, gun still raised, still pointed, though now his eyes had lost their earlier bravado. He looked at her like she was the one who had fired, like her refusal to cower had somehow pulled the trigger for him. "I thought he had a weapon," he said, voice thin, like paper soaked in oil. He moved like he was reaching. Camille hadn't lifted her eyes yet. She stayed focused on her husband's hand, now weak, now failing. She placed it gently over his chest as if that gesture alone could stop the tide. The blood pooled in the hollow of his collarbone, slid down his shoulder. Her sleeve was drenched. Her heart, unbroken, was tightening into something harder than bone. Finally, she looked up, not with tears, not with despair, but with fury so silent it made the world forget how to breathe. Her gaze met Brent's like a missile tracks heat, locking in, precise and deadly. Her voice came low and clear, shaped not for volume, but for permanence. "What you saw," she said, each word slicing through the heavy air, "was the man I love dying because he was afraid of you." Brent opened his mouth, but there was nothing to say. The hollow clatter of excuses had no room in her presence. His gun wavered, just a little. Wallace stood behind him, frozen. His face had gone pale, sweat glistening under the weak streetlight. He looked at Camille, not in fear, not quite, but with the unmistakable dread of a man who just realized he had backed the wrong kind of monster. Camille didn't move from the ground, her hands pressed against the wound, more ritual now than aid. Her husband's chest rose once, then stuttered. His mouth twitched, like he still wanted to tell her something, but the words were gone. The coiled hand in her lap gave one last tremble and then stopped. No cry, no gasp, just Camille, motionless, her breath held in like a blade unsheathed. Brent finally lowered his gun, but that didn't make him smaller, it only made the silence louder. He looked around, as if hoping the night itself could defend him. His voice came again, desperate now, shrinking. "He moved too fast. I warned him. He was reaching for something." Camille's eyes did not release him. He was reaching for his wallet. Wallace cleared his throat, but it sounded more like a choke. "There was no, he didn't threaten us. I didn't see a—" He trailed off, the words curdling in his mouth. Brent shot him a look, but it lacked its usual venom. His power was bleeding out faster than the body on the concrete. Behind them, someone had called dispatch. A voice crackled on the radio. Backup was on the way. Lights in the distance. Camille didn't turn. Her world was here. Kneeling in the street, soaked in the life of a man who had once made her believe the world could be gentle. That world had ended, not with war, not with a bomb, but with one gun, one man, one moment of cowardice masquerading as vigilance. She leaned down and whispered something to her husband. Just 3 words, nothing more. The kind of farewell that didn't beg for tomorrow, but honored yesterday. Then she stood, slowly, deliberately. Her movements are fluid, lethal in their stillness. She faced Brent again. "You shot a man who didn't raise his voice, who didn't raise their hand, who didn't raise a threat," she said. "And you did it because his skin looked louder than his words." Brent flinched, just slightly. Wallace looked down at the street, as if trying to disappear inside his shoes. Sirens echoed in the distance, chasing the night back toward order. But Camille didn't wait for the sirens. She didn't wait for justice. She didn't wait for permission. She looked at Brent, not as a victim would, not even as a widow would. She looked at him the way a soldier looks at a weak enemy, with complete awareness that the fight was not fair, but that it would end anyway. And when she turned her back on him, it wasn't surrender, it was a declaration. He had no power left, because what he had killed was not just a man. He had killed the illusion that silence meant safety, that compliance meant survival, that skin could be a weapon. And Camille would never let him forget that. Justice doesn't arrive with sirens. It comes late, limping, dressed in paperwork and armed with procedures designed to exhaust the truth. Camille stood in the white-lit hallway of the precinct, blood dried stiff on the hem of her dress. The fluorescent lights above buzzed like flies circling a corpse. Her posture hadn't changed since the street. Straight, composed, unreadable. But the eyes told a different story. They burned without blinking, scanning each officer who passed like she already knew their names, their ranks, their loyalties. In the interrogation room, the walls were beige, sterile, and insultingly neutral, decorated with laminated posters about workplace respect. A metal table divided the space, but it did nothing to separate the intent from the contempt. Across from her sat a detective with an aging smirk and the kind of face that had worn thin from too many nights of liquor and bias masquerading as judgment. He flipped open a file, slowly, theatrically, like a man trying to look busy while rehearsing a conclusion he'd already chosen. "So," he began, dragging the syllable as if to make it heavy, "you're the wife, the widow, excuse me." Camille didn't answer. Silence was still her sharpest blade. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers. "I'm trying to understand your reaction. Most people fall apart. You didn't shed a tear. It makes it hard to read. Suspicious, even." She turned her head slightly. Eyes cold, precise. "You mistake restraint for deception. That's your problem, not mine." He chuckled, leaning back, tipping his chair with casual arrogance. "Look, I've seen this before. Trauma does strange things. Some people lash out, some go quiet. But you seem almost rehearsed, like you came here knowing what to say." Camille's voice was quiet, but laced with iron. "No, but I came here knowing what I remember." The detective smirked, flipping through the report like it held secrets even he couldn't invent. "Brent and Wallace both say your husband made a sudden move, reached for something. Brent's body cam supports it, what's left of the footage anyway. It cuts out during the shot. Technical error. Convenient?" Camille replied, not missing a beat. He smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You want to play the resilient widow card? I get it. Strength in adversity, the media loves that angle. But you don't look like a grieving woman to me." Camille's jaw flexed, but her voice didn't rise. "That's because you don't know what grief looks like. You only recognize submission." The detective didn't appreciate that. His face hardened, the mask of smirking superiority slipping for a beat. "You want to be taken seriously? You might try acting like someone who just lost her husband." "I'm not acting," she said, each syllable measured, landing like dropped glass. "I just have an exceptional memory, and I know how to use it." They left her in that room longer than necessary, a game of slow degradation meant to poke holes in her resolve. But Camille didn't pace, she didn't slouch. She didn't touch the lukewarm water bottle they'd left as a prop for civility. She just sat, eyes fixed on the grain of the table, mind unblinking, tracking every angle of their strategy. She knew this game. Interrogation was theater, and she had once written the script in another language, in another life. Outside that room, Brent filed his official statement, shoulders squared like a man reciting lines from memory. Suspect reached suddenly into glove compartment. He declared to the recorder, refused orders. The officer felt the immediate threat, discharged one round in self-defense. His tone was clinical, pre-washed, scrubbed of guilt. He handed over a clipped segment of body cam footage, carefully edited to remove the buildup, leaving only the tension and the shot. A tight little narrative, just enough to suggest fear, just enough to be defensible. Wallace said nothing. He stood beside Brent, hands behind his back, lips pressed in a line that neither agreed nor objected. He didn't lie, but he didn't speak. His silence was not neutrality. It was a slow bleed of cowardice, dressed in procedural gray. Hours later, when Camille returned home, alone, empty-handed, no longer wife but not yet widow, she didn't collapse. She didn't fall to the floor and scream into her knees. She moved through her home like someone cataloging every shadow, each picture frame, each silence, each detail filed away, not for comfort, but for war. She walked past the foyer, into the study, and opened a drawer hidden beneath layers of dull correspondence. Her fingers moved with the certainty of routine. Behind an envelope marked Tax Documents 2021, she lifted a false panel and reached into the back. What she retrieved was small, wrapped in black tape, no labels. Just a USB drive marked with 3 notches on the side. Civilian eyes would have missed it, but Camille had learned long ago that eyes are not trained by birth. They're trained by betrayal. She plugged the drive into her laptop and waited. The footage was grainy, but the angle was golden. A camera mounted on a civilian building across the street, an automatic recording system meant to deter petty crime, had caught everything. The BMW, the approach, the posture, the hesitation, the shot. No reaching, no threat. Just the brutal overreaction of a man who couldn't tolerate stillness from someone who wouldn't fear him. Camille watched it twice, then saved a backup, then another. She encrypted the file, uploaded it to 3 secure servers, and made note of every digital fingerprint. Her hands didn't tremble. Her breath stayed steady. The only noise in the room was the hum of the hard drive, spinning like a countdown. She didn't text anyone, didn't call a lawyer, didn't post online. This wasn't about reaction. This was preparation, retaliation without recklessness. She pulled out a notebook from her drawer and wrote a single sentence across the top of a clean page. This story was written before the bullet, but not by me. Underneath, she listed times, names, angles, notes only she would understand. Back at the precinct, Brent was boasting to another officer about how cold she was, like a robot. He chuckled darkly over coffee, waving a donut like a trophy. Didn't cry once, barely moved. That's the type who cracks later. I'm telling you, she's not a problem. Wallace, sitting nearby, didn't respond, but something in his posture had shifted, a stiffness in the shoulders, a slight tremor in the hand that lifted his cup. Brent leaned back, smug. She's weak. Women like that, they don't fight back. They break quiet. But she hadn't broken. She had written, archived, filed away his cowardice. Brent didn't know it yet, but he had already lost control of the narrative. His version had been submitted, yes, but the truth, the unfiltered, uncut truth, now lived on 3 separate continents. And Camille wasn't chasing justice. She was building it, brick by brick, clip by clip, one calculated silence at a time. The silence Brent had mistaken for surrender was not silence at all. It was strategy dressed in restraint. While he filled the precinct air with smug laughter and the scent of burnt arrogance, Camille moved in shadows he didn't believe existed. He strutted into the squad room like a dog who thought he'd buried the bone deep enough. His voice cut across the hum of printers and worn keyboards, laced with a contempt that didn't even try to hide. He didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't even shout, Brant said, laughing like he'd found a glitch in human emotion. That kind? Soft, hollow inside. They don't cause trouble. A few of the younger officers nodded awkwardly, not in agreement, but because it was safer than contradicting him. Wallace, sitting in the corner of the room with a stale cup of coffee and eyes that hadn't slept, didn't laugh. He scratched at his wrist, a subconscious tic that had returned after a decade. He stared at the surface of his cup like it might offer a different truth than the one Brent was so eager to print on every mouth within earshot. There's something wrong with that woman, Wallace muttered finally. Brent cocked his head. You're just now realizing that? No, Wallace said slowly, as if translating thought into language cost him something. It's her eyes, cold, but not scared, like someone who's seen things, done things. Brent rolled his eyes. Save me the drama. She's probably some PTA chair with a CrossFit routine. You give these types too much credit, they start thinking they've got teeth. Wallace didn't answer, but the itch in his wrist crawled deeper. Across town, Camille sat at her kitchen table, papers spread in perfect order, laptop open but untouched. The footage she had recovered from the civilian camera played in loops behind her eyes. Every frame now burned into memory. She had filed the internal complaint earlier that morning, each section precise, annotated, calm. No emotion, no accusation, just facts. just timestamps, just a truth so irrefutable it didn't need embellishment. She knew it wouldn't go through. Not really. Institutions don't confess, they retreat, they delay, they dilute. When the confirmation of received landed in her inbox, she didn't smile. She highlighted it, flagged it, then closed the lid of her laptop. An hour later, the denial came. Formal, flat, expected. Lack of sufficient cause for misconduct review. No mention of the footage, no questions, no follow-up, just a dead end masquerading as due process. She opened her notebook, the same one she'd written in after watching her husband's body go still. On a clean line beneath the date, she wrote, "Truth does not require permission to exist." Then she tore the page out, folded it once, and placed it into the lining of her jacket. By late afternoon, Camille was already through the first checkpoint at the Military Oversight Bureau. The building stood like a relic of forgotten promises, a place where ethics were reviewed only after the fact. The clerk at the front desk gave her a bored look. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Camille replied. "Then I'm afraid. Tell your Justice Review officer someone from Ghost 6 wants to talk." The woman blinked, then straightened. A silence settled between them, tense, electric. She typed without asking another question, and called without waiting for instructions. Camille waited without shifting her weight, without looking around. Waiting was nothing to her. She had once waited 3 days in a flooded cave behind enemy lines, with nothing but a breathing straw and a knife. Within minutes, a plain-suited man appeared from the inner corridor. Gray tie, conservative cut, eyes that missed nothing. He scanned her face once, then again. "You served?" he asked. "Yes," Camille said. "And now I need your ears more than your mouth." He hesitated, but only for a beat. "Follow me." The room they entered was nothing like the cold steel of the precinct. It was lined in wood, quiet, with no cameras in sight. Here, people said things they weren't supposed to say. Camille placed a sealed envelope on the table between them. Evidence of misconduct, civilian footage, edited police body cam, false report, denial of complaint without review. He opened the envelope, scanned the printed screenshots, paused at a frame where Brent's arm rose, gun extended, eyes wide with panic and power. He looked back up at her. "And you're not asking for a case to be opened? I'm asking," she said calmly, "if someone with clearance high enough to know what Ghost 6 did in Kumar Province is brave enough to listen to what I'm willing to say." The silence wasn't long, but it mattered. His eyes locked on hers. "Do you know what you're risking by invoking that designation?" "I've risked more for less," Camille said, "and I'm done watching men with guns redefine what honor means just because no one will say otherwise." He closed the folder. "If what you're implying is real, this goes far beyond state lines." Camille didn't blink. "Then it's exactly where it needs to go." Back at the precinct, Brent was growing louder. The more control slipped from him, the more he postured. He berated a rookie for parking protocol, called a dispatcher sweetheart in a voice soaked with venom. Every joke was sharper, every laugh is too loud. Like a man building a wall with noise to drown out the creaking underneath, Wallace stood outside the briefing room, phone in hand, thumb hovering over a contact he didn't remember saving. It was a number labeled simply civilian camera. His jaw clenched. His thumb didn't move. He didn't call. Not yet. Inside, Brent muttered under his breath, "You give someone too much silence, they think they've won something." But Camille didn't need to win. She only needed the match to be lit, and she'd already struck it. And some women wore grief like veils. Camille wore hers like armor, quiet, seamless, and impossible to ignore. The morning light bled through the blinds in horizontal bands as she stood on the porch of a house where silence had become permanent. In her right hand, a small velvet box, the kind used for gifts and promises. Inside, it was no longer a symbol of forever, but of what was taken and what would never be returned. She rang the doorbell. The chime echoed through the frame like it was too soft for the weight she carried. The door opened slowly to reveal a woman older, thinner, but with the same eyes as her son, the same steel beneath the brown. Camille said nothing at first. She held out the box. Her fingers didn't tremble. They had learned never to do that. The mother opened it carefully. Inside The wedding ring sat against the velvet like a bullet in a case, dull, blood-stained, no longer gold but rusted with memory. The woman stared at it for a long time before she spoke. "Are you asking me to keep this?" "No," Camille said, voice even. "I'm asking you to remember what it cost." The woman didn't cry. She just closed the lid, slowly, and held it to her chest. "What are you going to do?" Camille met her eyes without blinking. "I'm going to make sure this entire country understands why a soldier never gets to sit quietly." Across town, Brandt was breaking rules with the same ease he broke protocol. The hallway was dark, the building closed, but that hadn't stopped him. He'd kicked open the door to Camille's office with a rage that felt more like necessity. Rage only needs justification when it's denied. Brandt had already decided he was owed this. He rifled through drawers, overturned folders, and yanked files loose from filing cabinets like they'd personally betrayed him. Sweat clung to his collar. His hands weren't shaking, not yet, but there was a twitch in his jaw he couldn't hide. The office didn't scream government. It screamed precision. No clutter, no chaos. Just control. That scared him more than any piece of paper he might find. He pulled open a drawer, expecting secrets. All he found was a photo, an old photograph, worn around the corners. It showed Camille in full combat uniform, sleeves rolled, dog tags visible, standing at attention next to an American flag in what looked like a desert outpost. Her face was younger, leaner, but the eyes were the same, steady, fixed, cold. The patch on her sleeve read Ghost 6. Brent stared at it for too long. Behind him, Wallace leaned against the doorframe, pale, hollow, eyes ringed with the kind of guilt that eats away at bone. "You didn't think she was just a housewife, did you?" Brent spun. "What the hell are you doing here?" Wallace didn't move. "I followed you. I figured you'd do something reckless. I just didn't think you'd be this stupid." Brent snorted, then laughed. But it came out more like a cough. "So now you're her lawyer?" "I'm the one who saw the whole thing," Wallace said quietly. "And I'm starting to think maybe that makes me dangerous to you." Brent's smile twisted into something mean. "Dangerous? You've been following orders since the academy. You don't even know how to spell dangerous?" Wallace took a step into the room. "Have you ever asked yourself why she didn't yell? Why didn't she cry?" "She was in shock," Brandt spat. "Frozen. That's what they do when you pull the mask off their privilege." Wallace shook his head. "No, she wasn't frozen. She was calculating. And that look she gave you, that wasn't fear." "Oh?" Brent sneered. "Then what was it, smart guy?" Wallace's voice dropped. "That was the look of someone who's buried more bodies than you've seen in traffic stops. That was someone who survived. You pointed a gun at a wolf and thought she was a lamb because she didn't bite." Brent scoffed, wiped sweat from his lip, then kicked the edge of the desk. "She's nothing. Just another widow looking for pity. All bark." Wallace stepped closer. "And you're what? The man who shot an unarmed civilian and thinks he can erase it with paperwork?" "He moved," Brent barked. "He moved." Wallace stared at him. "He reached for a wallet. We both know that. So does she. And now," he gestured around the room to the overturned furniture, the mess, "you've broken into her office looking for what? An eraser big enough to cover a bullet hole?" Brent didn't answer. His eyes were glassy. His chest heaved. Wallace looked down at the photograph still in Brent's hand. "You know what she is, don't you?" Brent dropped the photo like it burned. "She's a mistake. She's a ghost that should have died with him." Then he spat on the ground. Wallace flinched. Not from the action, but from the truth inside it. It wasn't just hatred in Brent's voice. It was fear. Brent was unraveling. And the more Camille didn't strike, didn't scream, didn't show her weapons, the more terrified he became. Because control isn't real when someone refuses to play your game. Brent picked up the photo again, now creased at the corner. He shoved it into his jacket, as if holding proof would give him back the advantage. "She thinks she's got dirt? Let her come. Let her try." Wallace said nothing, because he already knew. She wasn't trying. She was succeeding, and Brent didn't even realize he'd already lost. Some truths don't enter quietly. They wait for a room full of liars. then walk in standing tall. Camille arrived at the courthouse with no entourage, no press, no fanfare, just a closed-collar black suit, heels that didn't echo, and the kind of poise that turns heads before logic can explain why. The lobby fell silent as she passed through security. Even the scanner beeped quieter. Her eyes never wavered. Her stride never faltered. She was a woman walking into war, not onto a witness stand. Inside the hearing room, the energy was low, stale with the weight of expectation. People assumed this would be performative, another trial stuffed with technicalities, gasps, and legal sleight of hand. They didn't know they were about to witness a detonation. Brent was already seated at the defense table, draped in arrogant stillness. His attorney, a slick-haired man with too many teeth and not enough tact, leaned in and whispered something that made Brent chuckle. Wallace sat 2 rows behind, half-shadowed, jaw tight, posture shrinking. The judge, dry-voiced and disinterested, called for order. We begin preliminary hearings for the civil misconduct case of Camille Raines versus Brent Halverson. Plaintiff, you may proceed. The room turned. Camille stood, not rushed, not dramatic. She moved like precision clockwork. Each step calculated not to intimidate, but to dominate by presence alone. She didn't blink as the eyes of the courtroom weighed her down. She didn't shrink as the murmurs rippled through the crowd. She simply stood straight and still. And for a moment, the walls themselves seemed to brace for what came next. The defense rose first. Brent's attorney sauntered toward the bench with a smirk baked into his jawline. "Your Honor," he began, voice thick with smugness, "we would like it noted that the plaintiff brings this case with an unusual degree of pageantry. This is, after all, a courtroom, not a theater." He turned slightly toward Camille. "Oh, I admit, she's dressed the part, the grieving widow with the bone-dry eyes. I assume she's here to tell us a bedtime story about systemic injustice, dressed in black like it's opening night." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Do you have a legal objection, counselor?" "No," the attorney said, still smiling. "Just curiosity, because if I'm expected to take seriously the implication that my client acted with bias, I'd like to understand the credentials of the person making the claim." Camille didn't speak. Not yet. She simply reached up and removed her wig. Slow, deliberate, like peeling away camouflage. Underneath, her head was close-cropped, military sharp, not shaved to provoke, but trimmed in the way only those who've worn helmets in active fire zones understand. Gasps fluttered through the room. She rolled up the sleeve of her left arm. The black ink caught the fluorescent light and seemed to vibrate. A single insignia. Ghost 6. Not decorative, not commemorative, functional, real. The room stilled. Brent shifted in his seat. His jaw clenched so tight his teeth should have cracked. His lawyer tried to speak, but the words snagged in his throat. Camille stepped forward, just beyond the plaintiff's table, not bothering with the microphone. Her voice didn't need amplification. "I'm not here for pity," she said, her voice low and controlled, smooth like pressure behind a rifle trigger. "I'm not here for closure. I'm not here because I think the system works. I'm here because you need to understand exactly what happens when someone trained to survive war comes home and finds the battlefield waiting on a sidewalk." She scanned the room. "I don't care if you believe who I am. I don't need belief. I need you to understand one thing. I'm still alive, and I was trained to survive in spaces where no one was expected to come out whole." A murmur, sharp and sudden, cut through the back of the room. A man in uniform, Department of Defense credentials clipped to his jacket, stood slowly. He didn't raise his voice, didn't move closer. He just whispered, almost reverently, "Jesus Christ. She's Ghost 6. And with that, the room broke. Reporters scribbled. Clerks exchanged wide-eyed glances. The court photographer raised her camera but lowered it without shooting. The image wasn't hers to capture. Camille stood in the storm she had summoned, untouched, unmoved. The judge cleared his throat. "Ms. Raines, please remain by the stand." She nodded once. "Of course." Brent's lawyer attempted recovery. "Your Honor, I don't see how military service is relevant." Camille turned sharply, her gaze slicing into him like shrapnel. "It's relevant because the man you're defending pointed a loaded weapon at a trained combat veteran and acted like her calm was guilt. It's relevant because the man you're defending didn't see a citizen. He saw a threat. Because in his world, the more silent we are, the more dangerous we must be. And when we speak, well, that's just an escalation." The attorney stepped back. Camille stepped forward. "My silence didn't protect my husband. My silence didn't stop a bullet. So now I speak. And I speak not because I'm broken, but because I was built for this. You think I walk in here looking for sympathy? No, I walk in here to make sure men like Brent Halverson stop confusing power with permission." The judge didn't interrupt. No one did. Brent, hunched now, stared at the table like it might open and swallow him whole. His lawyer leaned in, whispered urgently. Camille didn't need to hear it. She already knew. Their strategy had evaporated. The theater they joked about had become a tribunal, and she was no longer the plaintiff. She was the commanding officer of the truth. And the silence that followed her last words wasn't awkward. It was reverence. It was reckoning. It was the sound of a courtroom realizing it had underestimated a woman, not because she was quiet, but because they'd forgotten what silence looks like when it decides to speak. The air in the courtroom still vibrated from Camille's reveal, but she stood steady in the eye of it, composed not out of habit, but out of principle. The judge cleared his throat to bring the room back into some semblance of order, but it was futile. The order had already changed allegiance. It now belonged to the woman standing at the center, not by title, but by gravity. The court clerk called the next motion, but it barely mattered. Brent was being called to testify, not as a defender, not even as a witness. Today he was simply the man who pulled a trigger, and now had to explain it to someone who had walked through hell without once asking for applause. He took the stand with the bravado of a cornered animal, still baring teeth, still pretending the cage was just a room with bad lighting. His lawyer had prepped him, surely, but nothing in his manual had prepared him for the way Camille watched him walk to the seat, not with rage, not with fear, but with the stillness of someone who had seen people die with less warning and more honor. Camille's lips were tight. Brant repeated it. His voice held, but just barely. The judge gave Camille the nod. She rose. No binder in hand, no stack of notes, no theatrical pacing. She approached the witness stand with the weight of something inevitable. Her voice was calm. "Mr. Halverson, have you ever served in Mosul?" Brent blinked. His smirk twitched. "Excuse me? You heard me," he scoffed, leaning back. "Lady, is this a courtroom or story hour? You here to tell war tales now?" "I'm not here to tell," Camille said evenly. "I'm here to correct." Brent leaned forward slightly, trying to conjure authority in a room that had already stopped giving him any. "I've worn the badge for 15 years. That counts for something." Camille's tone didn't change. "I didn't ask about your badge, I asked about Mosul." "No," Brent said finally, dismissively. "I've never been to the sandbox, never needed to. My fight's here, not overseas." Camille tilted her head slightly. "So you've never walked through a live corridor, with your team bleeding out behind you, never waited for a chopper under enemy fire, not knowing if it was friendly or a trap, never had to dig your trench while mortar shells sang lullabies above your head." Brent's jaw tightened. "What does this have to do with anything?" She took a step closer. "Everything," she said, "because you looked at a man reaching for his wallet and saw combat. You pulled a trigger like you'd been trained for battle, but you've never been to one. And you stood over a dying body like you understood the weight of death, but you've never earned that understanding." Brent shifted. Sweat formed just above his collarbone. Camille continued, voice a blade slicing air. "You never earned fear the right way. You manufactured it, you weaponized it, you used it to explain a mistake that was never tactical. It was ego. And now you're sitting here trying to make us believe it was instinct, that you thought my husband was a threat, that the silence of a black man with nothing in his hands was somehow the same thing as aggression?" Brent looked to the judge, desperate for an interruption. None came. "You didn't see a threat," Camille went on. "You saw a mirror, and you fired to make the reflection Go away." Brent's mouth opened, no sound. Wallace, seated behind the railing, reached into his jacket and pulled out a handkerchief, pressing it gently to his forehead. The courtroom was not warm, but his skin was damp, his breathing as shallow. He wasn't being spoken to, but he was being addressed all the same. Camille turned slightly, addressing the room. "There's something you all should understand," she said. Brent Halverson did not act alone. Oh, he pulled the trigger, yes, but that act was stitched together by years of reinforced cowardice. Every training seminar emphasized compliance over compassion. Every unchecked complaint, every wink from a superior that said, "Don't worry, you're one of us." That bullet was bureaucratically blessed. The judge cleared his throat, but didn't stop her. The prosecution didn't move. Brent's lawyer sat frozen. Camille turned back to the witness stand. "Who, let me ask again, Mr. Halverson, do you know what war looks like?" Brent's face had lost its color. "You're making this personal." Camille's eyes narrowed. "It was personal the moment you pointed a weapon at my husband and decided his skin made him a combatant." Brent looked down, then back up, defiant but breaking. "Thought he was reaching for a gun," he muttered. He didn't respond fast enough. Camille didn't flinch. "You mean he didn't flinch fast enough?" She leaned in, lowering her voice so the whole room had to lean in to hear. "Do you know how many times I've stared down a real threat? People with explosives strapped to their ribs? Snipers are trained better than you'll ever dream, and I never once fired without seeing the weapon. I never once pulled a trigger because someone made me feel small. But you did. You pulled yours because my husband's quiet was louder than your entire career." Brent breathed through his nose like a man trying not to vomit. His hands gripped the sides of the chair as if it could keep him from unraveling. Wallace pressed the cloth to his temple again. His hand trembled now. Camille stood upright, her posture still perfect. "Let the record show," she said to the court, "that Brent Halverson admits under oath he had no combat experience, no visual confirmation of a weapon, and yet he chose to discharge his firearm into the chest of an unarmed civilian, and he did so with the confidence of a man who has never had to answer to anyone before today." The court stenographer's fingers flew. Brent looked at Wallace, silent, ghost pale. They weren't officers anymore. They were exposed. And Camille wasn't a witness. She was the reckoning. The silence that followed Camille's final words in the cross-examination didn't dissolve, it thickened, settled, took root. It wasn't the hush of awkwardness or fear. It was the weight of truth hanging heavy in the lungs of every person seated in that courtroom. Brent sat frozen, still perched on the witness stand, hands curled tight around the wooden armrests, as though he could grip reality hard enough to reshape it. Wallace no longer dabbed his forehead. He simply sat, head lowered, the man who once followed orders now sitting beneath them. The judge called for a 10-minute recess, but no one moved. When the court resumed, Camille didn't need permission to shift the room's gravity back to her. She stood without theatrics, carrying a single manila folder which she laid carefully on the table, before walking to the presentation screen set up behind the counsel tables. She spoke without preamble. "Let the record reflect that what I'm about to present is not interpretation. It is documentation, signed, authenticated, and verified through military channels." She opened the folder, pulled out a printed image, and clipped it onto the projection stand. The screen blinked, then displayed a black and white medical scan. One of her spine, its vertebrae punctuated by fragments of shrapnel like tiny ghosts of a war she never asked for. She turned another page, photos now. One showed her arm, torn near the bicep, the skin soldered back together by field stitches. Another captured the bruising across her ribs, trauma that didn't heal pretty. Camille's voice was still velvet, but now it had wire inside. "This is my body," she said. "Documented after Operation Blacklight, 2015. I served under blackout conditions for 8 weeks, off-grid with no backup. I carried 6 of my men to the evacuation while my chest was fractured in 2 places. I did not ask for this assignment. I did not volunteer for the medal. I survived because it was the only way to make sure someone else did." She placed the papers down and held up a letter. its header stamped with the emblem of the United States Department of Defense. "This," she continued, "is confirmation of my role in that operation, my identity, my authorization level, and my classification as Ghost 6. The courtroom didn't gasp this time. It exhaled. Brent shot to his feet as though the ground beneath him had turned to fire. "She's lying. That's fake. There's no Camille Raines on any active duty record. You check the rosters, you check the names. She's not there." Camille didn't even look at him. She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a small, weathered piece of plastic, faded, its edges curled, but still bearing the holographic shimmer of authenticity. She walked directly to the judge, handed it across the bench, and returned to the center of the room without a single glance to her left or right. The judge inspected it, eyes narrowing slightly, then gestured toward the back row. "Would the Department of Defense representative please confirm this document?" The man who had stood in awe before now stepped forward with the weight of history behind each footfall. He took the card, read it silently, then turned to the judge with a steady nod. "That ID is authentic," he said, "issued under deep clearance protocol. Camille Raines held the designation Ghost 6 during Operation Blacklight. Her name would not appear in standard military directories due to the classified nature of her work. I can attest to her record." The silence cracked, not with noise, but with understanding. Camille turned her head, not to Brent, to Wallace. He sat up straight, but couldn't meet her gaze. Camille walked toward him, not threatening, not accusatory, but with that same relentless calm that had become her most dangerous weapon. "I don't need you to apologize," she said softly. "I don't need you to confess. I just need you to know. You stood next to him. You backed his lie, but now you've seen the truth, and the truth doesn't ask your permission to exist." Wallace's throat moved, but no words came. Finally, after what felt like a crack forming across his ribs, he whispered, I didn't know." Camille leaned in, voice gentle, surgical. "Now you do." She turned back to the room, reclaiming center space without a raised voice or a courtroom trick, just presence. "You all looked at me and saw someone silent, someone polite, someone composed. You thought that meant I was manageable, that I was just another name on a docket. But I'm not here to be managed. I'm here because my husband bled into my arms while a man trained in nothing but paranoia pretended to be a soldier." She walked slowly back to the projection stand. "I brought these injuries home from a real war, but the worst wound I've carried was watching a man die in peace, in a place that was supposed to be safe, at the hands of someone who had no idea what war looks like." She stopped. Then she faced the judge. "I'm not asking for a miracle. I'm not asking for closure. I'm asking that the record reflect one simple truth, that blood is not ink, that dying doesn't make someone guilty. What was done to my husband was not fair. It was execution." The judge sat very still. Even the stenographer had stopped typing, her fingers hovering above the keys as if afraid to dilute the moment by recording it too fast. Brent, still standing, looked around the room for backup, for support, for oxygen, but there was none. He had been exposed, not with rage, not with drama, with facts, with scars, with a military-grade precision he never saw coming. The courtroom had grown used to Camille delivering truth with precision, but what came next wasn't words. It was evidence that didn't need narration. She stepped to the screen with the same quiet authority she'd worn since day one, inserted a drive, and pressed play without commentary. The lights dimmed slightly as the projector hummed to life. What filled the screen was raw, unstaged, and unmistakably real. Footage from Syria, grainy from dust and heat, but undeniable in what it showed. Camille, barely 30, stood behind a crumbling archway, her uniform soaked in blood that wasn't all hers. One arm wrapped tightly around a teenage hostage, the other clutching a battered rifle. Her eyes didn't blink. Her posture didn't shake. The camera shook more than she did. A grenade had just gone off behind her. Shrapnel hung in the air like broken promises, and yet her finger stayed on the trigger, not twitching, not flinching, not hesitating. A man with a weapon burst into the frame. She pivoted, fired a single shot, and didn't break stride. The room watched in arrested silence as she dragged the hostage to cover, ignoring the crimson blooming across her back, lifting the boy onto a truck as smoke poured around them like a second skin. She didn't look at the camera, she didn't pose, she simply survived. Then, a voice cracked the silence like a whip of desperation. "This isn't relevant." Brandt's lawyer stood so suddenly his chair crashed backward, voice pitching higher with every word. "This is out-of-context military propaganda. This doesn't belong in a civilian courtroom." Camille turned to face him, but she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "No," she said clearly, firmly. "This is exactly why your client had no right to kill the man I loved. This is exactly why your client's fear is not my responsibility, nor his excuse. Because when you've lived through actual danger, you know what it looks like, and you don't fabricate it just to justify cowardice." Brent didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat moved. His jaw clenched, but no sound emerged. He wasn't a man anymore. He was an outline, something waiting to be erased. Camille took a step forward, eyes fixed on him, the air between them dense with everything unspoken. "You held a badge and thought that made you brave," she said. "But you've never stood in front of a real fire. You've never protected anything except your reflection. You shoot and call it duty. I bled, and I called it survival." Wallace rose from his seat then, not out of respect, not out of protest, out of exhaustion. He didn't speak, didn't ask permission. He simply walked out of the courtroom, the weight of silence dragging behind him like a broken oath. Camille didn't watch him go. Her eyes never left Brent. "You want to silence me," she said, each word shaped like the blade she never had to draw. "But silence already cost me too much. When you fired, I stayed quiet. When you lied, I stayed calm. But now you listen. Now you sit there and hear every damn syllable, because it's not your courtroom anymore. It's mine." Brent tried to swallow, tried to square his shoulders, but his suit felt too tight and the room too cold. He had fired a bullet without knowing the weight of war. And now he was standing in front of someone who had carried explosives for justice, and never once used them on the wrong soul. The room still trembled under the aftershock of Camille's voice. She hadn't shouted. She didn't need to. Her words had wrapped themselves around the very foundation of the courtroom, suffocating every hollow excuse, every fragile defense. Brant sat collapsed into his posture, hunched forward, eyes locked onto the wood grain of the table as if it could save him. Wallace hadn't returned to his seat. He stood just inside the doorway, suspended like a man who no longer belonged to any side. The judge gave a shallow nod. "Emmys Raines, you may give your final statement for this phase." She rose, without theatrics, no dramatic breath, no notes in hand, no trembling hands or cracking voice. Her suit remained perfectly smooth, her hair still neat, but something in the room shifted the moment she stepped forward, a stillness that didn't ask for attention. It demanded reverence. She didn't speak right away. Her eyes traveled slowly over the faces before her, not with judgment but with disappointment, like a soldier surveying a field where none had dared to stand. Then, finally, she leaned into the microphone. Her voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. 90 seconds, she'd been told. She would only need 60. "You don't know me," she began, her tone steady, deliberate. Each syllable dropped like a weight. "And maybe you never will, but from this moment forward, every time someone who looks like me walks out their front door, you'd better believe they could be me." "But," he asked, maybe you never will, but from this moment forward, every time someone who looks like me walks out their front door, you'd better believe." No one moved. No one even blinked. "I trained to defend this country. I bled for people I never met. I buried those I called family. And when I came home, I didn't expect parades. I didn't expect medals. But I never expected to have to bury the man I loved because someone saw his stillness as a threat. Her hand moved slowly, almost ceremonially, into the inside pocket of her blazer. From it she drew a folded triangle of cloth, crisp, tight, blue with stars, neatly pressed like the silence of every funeral it had ever known. The courtroom seemed to contract with that single gesture. "I never wanted to unfold this again," she said, her eyes never leaving the audience. "I carried it home once from a foreign land. I swore I would never use it again, but today I use it, not to honor the dead, but to expose the broken." She placed the flag carefully on the plaintiff's table. It didn't fall, it didn't flutter, it simply existed, undeniable, unyielding, like the truth it represented. "This is not a symbol of sacrifice today," she continued, softer now. "It's a mirror for your system, your courts, your shields, your silence. You've wrapped yourselves in procedure and paper and convinced yourselves that it makes you righteous, but all it did was permit you to forget how to see people." Still no one spoke. Even the judge had stopped adjusting his robe. Camille took one step back. "You don't have to believe my pain. You don't even have to believe my proof. But you will remember this flag. And you will remember the day someone used it not to bury a soldier, but to confront the country that made his death possible." Grant had not moved. His knuckles were white, gripping the edge of the table, as if Camille's voice was a storm and the oak could keep him from drowning. He didn't interrupt. He couldn't. Somewhere between her first word and this moment, his power had dissolved, not because she'd taken it from him, but because he'd never owned it to begin with. Camille didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her job was done. Wallace turned slowly, just enough to catch her final glance. Not accusatory, not forgiving, just final. He didn't sit down again, and no one else dared to breathe until the flag stopped shifting on the table, as if even the air had learned something. The echo of Kama's words still pulsed through the walls of the courthouse like a low-frequency wave no one could turn off. Brent Halverson didn't wait for the air to clear. As soon as the gavel struck recess, he was already calculating the least visible route out of the building. No crowd, no cameras, no confrontation. He slipped through a side corridor meant for staff and attorneys, the fluorescent lighting above humming like a warning. Every footstep felt too loud in his ears, like his shoes were betraying him. He didn't walk like an officer anymore. He walked like a man whose name had finally been matched with consequence. The exit door clicked open, and he stepped into the alley behind the courthouse, where he believed the shadows would keep him safe. They didn't. The first camera flash came like a blade of light slicing across his vision, then another and another. The alley was swarming with press, lean, hungry, relentless. Microphones shot toward him like spears. "Officer Halverson, how do you respond to Camille Rain's testimony? Were there other excessive force complaints? Did you ever falsify reports? Do you feel safe right now?" And then, the voice that cut sharper than the rest. "Are you afraid now?" His mouth tightened, but the smirk tried to appear. "This is just performance," he muttered, his voice dry, defensive, aimed at no one and everyone. "I'm not on trial. I'm the story they need." But his eyes betrayed him. They darted from flash to flash, from lens to lens, seeking an escape route that didn't exist. His face, half turned and half exposed, flickered with something raw and unfamiliar, uncertainty. In that moment, he didn't look like a man used to carrying a gun. He looked like a man facing his first real crowd, and discovering the crowd didn't care about his badge. 2 floors above the chaos, Camille sat in silence, her expression unreadable. She wasn't watching Brent's performance on the live feed. She didn't need to. She'd already sent the match into the haystack. She now waited only for the ignition. Her laptop screen glowed with a draft letter, a legal document addressed to the City Review Board. No dramatics, no monologue, just facts and formal language. Subject line: request for full public disclosure of Officer Brent Halverson's 3-year use of force history, including traffic stop data, citation records, internal complaints, and civil inquiries. Her lawyer sat opposite her, adjusting his tie like it were strangling him. "You realize what this might do," he said, almost cautiously. Camille didn't glance up. "I do." He leaned back slightly. "If they approve this, and they might, it'll set a precedent. The city could try to bury it, drag it through procedural loops. The union will scream retaliation." She clicked a key, scrolling to the bottom of the document. "They'll delay, they won't deny. If they do, it's an admission, which they're not smart enough to avoid or dumb enough to say," the lawyer muttered. Camille finally met his eyes. "They've kept quiet for years because silence worked. Until now." He sat back, watching her. "What is your objective here, Camille?" She didn't blink. "Exposure. That's not legal language. It doesn't need to be," she replied. "It's the only kind of justice they've never rehearsed for." He watched her sign the document digitally, attach the timestamp, and send it through the encrypted channel. And just like that, the line between accusation and documentation disappeared. Elsewhere, the walls were sweating. Inside a municipal briefing room lit with flickering overheads and layered in the scent of coffee gone bitter, Wallace Kim sat slumped in a metal chair like someone waiting for a storm he couldn't outpace. The air wasn't hot, but his palms were damp, his breathing was shallow, timed like a man trained to stay still, while chaos unfolded around him. He stared blankly at the table in front of him, on which sat a printed copy of a document he hadn't expected to see again, a Department of Defense validation letter, stamped and signed, with Camille Raines's name highlighted in ink. Above it, 3 words stared back at him in red marker: confirmed. Below it, a photo of her in uniform, younger but unmistakably herself, bearing the Ghost 6. He didn't touch it, he just looked, and kept looking. A voice in the room broke the silence. Gruff, defensive. Another officer, one still wearing the arrogance that used to bind their whole department together. "If she wins this," the officer said, pacing in the back of the room, "everything crumbles. The board, the union shielding, will be audited, our files opened, every past mistake will bleed onto headlines like it just happened." Wallace said nothing. Another voice chimed in. "We'll lose pensions. Lawsuits will pile. They'll come for us like wolves." Still, Wallace remained motionless, as if movement might validate their fear. The pacing officer leaned against the wall, eyes narrowing. "You were there. Day 1. If she buries Brent, she buries all of us." Wallace slowly lowered his gaze to his lap, where his fingers had tightened into fists without him realizing it. "If she wins," he said finally, barely above a whisper, "then we never deserved what we had." The others froze. No one had expected that. He raised his head slowly. "We covered for him, even when we didn't agree. We watched him bend the truth and called it discretion. And now we're sitting in a room trying to figure out how to salvage our image instead of asking why she even needed to come this far." A beat passed. Then another. "You sound like you're on her side now," someone spat. Wallace looked back down at the confirmed stamp and answered quietly, "I think she's just the first one who made us look in a mirror." Downstairs, the courthouse buzzed like a hive, jarred loose from its rhythm. Camille walked past the press pool without a glance, cutting through the noise like a blade through fog. Every step she took was measured, not hesitant, but deliberate. The weight of grief no longer dragged her spine, it reinforced it. She didn't wear armor. Back inside the war room turned strategy office, her attorney skimmed the city's preliminary response to the public records request. His brow furrowed. "They're stalling," he said. "Standard procedural delay. 10 business days to process, maybe more." Camille took the printed email from his hand and read the bureaucratic jargon without flinching. "That gives them 10 days to decide how much of the truth they think they can survive." He hesitated. "We could push, file injunctions, call a press conference, pressure the mayor." "No," she said. "Let them flinch first. I'm not the one hiding anything." He leaned forward. "You're calculating." "I'm exact," she corrected. Then, as if something unspoken passed between them, she added, "The world doesn't care what I lost. They care what I reveal. Her phone buzzed. Not media, not allies. A message from an anonymous source. A single line. Someone's digging through your military record. Camille showed the screen to her lawyer. Tell me they won't find a way to twist that, too. He shook his head. It's sealed, and what little that's public already favors you. Unless someone's willing to commit career suicide by forging a file, they're only going to remind the world that you were forged in fire, not broken by it. Camille nodded once and looked toward the window, where Brent's silhouette still lingered on a live TV feed. He was boxed in by lights, microphones, and questions, his body recoiling from the attention he used to command. But it wasn't fame anymore. It was exposure. Do you think he feels it yet? Her attorney asked. Not yet, she replied. But he will. The lights used to follow him like applause. Now they burn like judgment. And just outside the courthouse, Brent's hands had finally started to tremble. The next morning, Brent Halverson sat in his apartment surrounded by silence that wasn't peace. It was pressure. The shades were drawn, but he couldn't stop imagining the light outside wasn't daylight, but camera flashes waiting to pounce. His TV played muted news coverage of the trial. Every image a reminder he no longer controlled the narrative. Headlines bled across the screen. Former Officer Halverson under scrutiny. Ghost-sick testimony sparks wave of investigations. From battlefield to courtroom, Camille Raines unmasks systemic decay. His name used to mean authority. Now it meant rot. His phone rang twice. He didn't answer. A message popped up. Internal Affairs requesting a follow-up interview. Urgent. Another came through. A local journalist requesting comment, before we publish the interview with your former colleagues. He unplugged the phone, threw it across the room. It hit the wall and dropped. The screen spiderwebbed like his last illusion of safety. At the same hour, Camille sat in a quiet corner of a cafe, hood low over her brow, sipping black coffee like it were a ritual. She wasn't hiding. She was observing. On the table before her lay a printed list. Names, dates, badge numbers, every single stop, citation, or incident tied to Brent over the last 3 years. Sourced not from the city, but from a public archive a retired whistleblower had mirrored out of spite years ago. It wasn't comprehensive, but it was enough. Her attorney glanced over the list and shook his head. There's a pattern. Stops are skewed by race. Excessive force was not filed as such. The man was a walking liability wrapped in qualified immunity. Camille didn't respond right away. Then she folded the list neatly. Liabilities are only dangerous when no one's watching. Let's make sure they watch. And watch they did. That afternoon, she filed a new motion. A motion to subpoena all body cam footage from a specific 5-week period tied to those stops. The court clerk barely blinked when stamping the request. Camille's presence had become a fact of the building, like oxygen, like gravity, like reckoning. Brent, watching the headline scroll across a ticker on his TV, knew it then, not in theory, but in marrow. The mask was off. The light wasn't moving away, it was closing in. And Camille? She never raised her voice. She never reached for vengeance. She only held a mirror to his face and let the world decide what it saw. The silence that followed Camille's last move wasn't quiet. It was loaded. The courthouse had emptied of its noise, but not of its energy. Brent ducked away from reporters, and Wallace vanished without a word. But the truth didn't retreat. It seeped through headlines, courtroom sketches, and screenshots that tore through social feeds like wildfire. It lingered. It stared back. Camille didn't chase anyone. She waited, and Wallace came. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. She'd left the office door open. A silent message that said, I know you're coming, and I'm not afraid. Wallace stepped in, slower than usual, shoulders down. Not like a man entering a room, but like one being summoned by his conscience. He looked older, or maybe it was just the light. He closed the door behind him, gently, as if loud noises might shatter what little composure he had left. For a second, he said nothing. Then, I thought you were just somebody's wife. Camille didn't lift her eyes from the file she was reading. Her voice came low, even, slicing. That's why you didn't see me coming. He nodded once. not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of his failure. I followed Brent's lead because I thought you were just another civilian screaming into a void. But you didn't scream. You waited. You remembered. She closed the folder, finally looking at him. Her gaze didn't shake. I didn't have to scream. The facts do that for me. Wallace shifted, jaw twitching. I watched that body cam video, the uncut one, the full version. Kamel tilted her head slightly, just enough to say she already knew. And he swallowed hard. I saw what I chose not to say that night. I saw the pause before Brent pulled the trigger. I saw the look in your eyes. I saw the way you held him when he stopped, couldn't finish. I saw everything. Camille leaned forward, placed a blank affidavit on the table between them, followed by a pen. Then, write it. Wallace stared at the empty lines. This could end my career. Camille's voice was razor sharp. Your career ended the moment you let a man die so you could keep your pension intact. He gripped the pen, but his hand trembled. I thought you were weak, he said, eyes never leaving the page. Because you didn't flinch. Because you didn't rage. I thought silence meant surrender. Emil's response was low, but ferocious. Silence is a strategy, not submission. He blinked. Aren't you afraid I'll sign this, then back out? No, she said, her voice like cold steel. Because I'm not asking you to be brave. I'm showing you how dangerous your cowardice already is. He looked at her, finally, and for the first time, Wallace Kim didn't see a widow. He didn't see a former soldier. He didn't even see a victim. He saw judgment, and worse, he saw the truth. The pen hovered for seconds that felt like a lifetime. Wallace's hand remained shaky, but it moved. One stroke, then another. The sound of ink against paper was unsteady, uneven, like the breath of a man cracking open the vault he'd built to protect himself from the truth. He wasn't signing heroically. He wasn't offering redemption. What spilled onto that affidavit was messy, fragmented, but it was real. Camille didn't watch him write. She looked past him, out the window, where the early dusk painted the city in a smudged palette of gold and ash. The skyline looked like it was bleeding light. It fit. Wallace finally exhaled. He didn't hand the paper to her. He slid it forward like an offering to a higher court. There, he muttered, voice ragged. It's done. Camille picked up the sheet, read only the first line, then folded it and slid it into a plain envelope. She sealed it without a word. Wallace sat back, his shoulders loosening for the first time, as if expecting her to say something kind, something human. She didn't. What happens now? He asked, not because he didn't know, but because he wanted her to absolve him, just a little, just enough to breathe. Camille's eyes never left his. Now, you wake up every day knowing you watched a man get executed for being married to me, and you did nothing. Wallace looked down at the table, fingers curling into fists again. I told myself it wasn't my fault. I told myself Brent was the one pulling the trigger. Hemmel was, Camille replied calmly, but you loaded the chamber with your silence. He flinched. Camille leaned forward, voice cool as glass. You want to make it right? Don't hide. Don't vanish into retirement. Stand in front of the world and admit who you were, not who you wish you'd been. Wallace shook his head slightly. You think anyone will believe me now? They don't need to believe you, she said. They just need to see you for what you are, and that's already begun. Outside, the courthouse banners still fluttered, those same words scrawled boldly across signs, justice for the widowed general. But inside, it was something far less poetic. A man stripped of uniform, stripped of excuses, staring down the consequences he'd spent years outrunning. And the woman across from him wasn't vengeance. She was precise, surgical, inevitable. Wallace didn't speak for a long time. The silence stretched between them like a wire, taut, invisible, and one wrong breath away from snapping. He was sweating, not because the room was warm, but because he finally understood what it meant to sit across from a person who knew exactly how much damage he'd done and had no intention of letting him forget it. Camille didn't fill the silence. She let it stay. Silence was a weapon now. It forced him to sit with the weight of his cowardice. I wasn't always like this, Wallace said at last. almost to himself. I joined the force thinking I'd make a difference, that I'd stop the bad guys, protect the good ones. You know, the whole damn fantasy. Camille blinked slowly. Then, at some point, you decided the badge protected you more than it protected them. He nodded faintly, shame blooming under his skin. Yeah, somewhere along the way, I stopped looking for truth. I started looking for what wouldn't get me in trouble. That's not fear, she said. That's betrayal. Wallace bristled. You think I don't know that? Every time I close my eyes, I see it. Him gasping, you screaming without making a sound, Brent's smug face, and me. No, Camille interrupted, her voice like cut marble. You weren't frozen. You were calculating. You measured the risk, saw a black man bleeding and a white officer shouting he moved, and you did the math. You gambled on the system protecting you, and it did. Wallace lowered his gaze again, his throat thick with something that tasted like rust. I didn't mean for him to die. That's the lie you tell yourself, Camille said flatly. The truth. You didn't care enough to stop it. The words landed like gunfire. Wallace didn't try to defend himself. He had no defense. Outside, car horns blurred into each other. Somewhere in the city, protests stirred again. The tension hadn't left the streets. It had just changed uniforms. Camille stood. Wallace flinched instinctively, as if expecting her to raise her voice or lash out, but she didn't move toward him. She walked to the shelf behind her desk, opened a drawer, and retrieved a second envelope. This, she said, placing it beside the affidavit he'd signed, is your copy. You keep it. You read it every time you think silence is easier than truth. Wallace stared at it like it might burn him. Camille's voice low and final. You don't get a redemption arc. You get a sentence, and you serve it by watching your name unravel every time someone asks why no one stopped Brent. He turned away, signaling the conversation was over, but Wallace remained in his chair, shoulders sagging under the weight of his history, the paper in front of him as heavy as any chain. He stood only when she no longer looked at him, not as a signal to leave, but because he couldn't stand being in her line of sight any longer. The door creaked faintly behind him as he stepped out into the hallway, the envelope gripped in one sweating hand like a live grenade without a pin. No one else saw the moment. No press, no cameras, no record, but it would live with him far longer than any headline. Camille sat back down, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, but with certainty. There was no pleasure in dismantling a man, only necessity. Back in the hallway, Wallace moved like a ghost. His feet dragged, his spine curled in on itself. He didn't go back to his car right away. He sat on a bench outside the building, staring at the paper in his hands. The sky had darkened. A chill bled through the wind. Pedestrians passed by without knowing they were walking past a man who had spent his life pretending justice was someone else's responsibility. And now, there it was, sitting in his palm, signed with ink he could no longer erase. Inside, Camille dialed her attorney and spoke only 5 words. He signed it. Send it. Then she ended the call, rose again, and walked to the window. Below, Wallace still sat motionless, a collapsed statue of faded authority and late regret. Her reflection looked back at her in the glass, not as a widow, not as a soldier, not as a victim, as a force, the kind of force that bends silence into shape and presses guilt into confession without raising her voice. She turned away, pulled a fresh sheet of paper, and began writing again. Not notes for court, not a speech, just a heading, next move. In another part of the city, Brent scrolled through headlines on his phone, his thumb trembling just enough to make each page flick by too fast. The damage was spreading, and he could feel it. The eyes, the shift, the way people now paused a second longer before shaking his hand. He slammed the phone down, muttering to himself, "She's not done yet." He was right. Camille's war wasn't over. It had just entered the next phase, and Wallace Kim would be its first public crack. The affidavit would go out within the hour. His signature would go live, posted by the legal team with nothing more than the caption, "Witness to silence." His name would trend, his inbox would flood, and with every refresh of his screen, he would see what Camille meant when she said he would live with it, not just privately, But publicly, she hadn't destroyed him. She'd revealed him. And that, Camille understood now, was more powerful than revenge, because some men don't need to be punished, they need to be seen. Brent sat with his back unnaturally stiff, his eyes darting toward the door like a cornered animal calculating escape routes. The courtroom lights felt hotter today, or maybe it was the presence of the media, their cameras like silent predators, lenses focused and waiting for blood. Camille entered not with theatrics but with a quiet intensity that was somehow louder than applause. She didn't look at Brent. She didn't need to. The weight of what she carried would speak louder than any confrontation. When the clerk announced the next exhibit, a sharp click echoed as Camille loaded the USB into the display terminal. The judge didn't blink. Brent's attorney shifted uncomfortably. Camille stepped aside as the screen lit up. It was a simple training room. A poorly lit video, the date in the corner showed it was from last year. Brent stood in front of a group of cadets, pacing with artificial bravado. His voice filled the courtroom speakers. "You see a guy like that? Black hoodie, twitchy hands, eyes darting. 9 out of 10, it's a thug. Don't wait. Don't think. Just shut it down." The room went still. Then the next line dropped like a hammer. Some of these black bastards don't understand words, but they understand fear. That's what your badge is for, to make 'em kneel before they get brave. Camille didn't flinch. She didn't glance around to see reactions. The silence was answer enough. A gasp broke from someone in the back row. The judge's jaw tightened. Brent's face turned the color of raw meat. The clip ended and the screen went black. Then Brent exploded. He shot to his feet and slammed his hand on the table. "This is a violation of my privacy. That was an internal session. You had no right to—" Camille stepped forward, voice low and cutting. "And my husband had no right to die in a car for existing." Brent's mouth opened, but the words didn't come. They caught on the raw edge of exposure. He looked around the room as if searching for someone to back him up, but Wallace didn't move. The judge remained impassive. Camille stood closer now, closing the space between them not with violence, but with truth sharpened to a point. "My husband paid taxes. He taught high school kids. He didn't carry a gun. He reached for his wallet." Her voice didn't rise, but it thickened with a steel that demanded attention. "You looked at him and saw a target. Then you saw me, and you felt something worse than fear. You felt challenged, and so you pulled the trigger." A man in the audience shouted, "Tear his damn badge off!" Another louder, "Hang that racist bastard!" Brent turned, startled. The crowd had changed. They weren't watching anymore. They were hunting. Their eyes were no longer curious. They were judgmental, furious, and hungry for justice denied for too long. Camille lifted her hand, not to silence them, but to redirect the fire. "I don't want him dead," she said calmly. "That's too easy." The courtroom leaned in. "I want him to live, to walk down every street knowing every face has seen him for who he is. I want every child to hear their name and spit. I want him to lose sleep knowing that no matter how long he wears a suit or hides behind policies, people will remember this. He called my husband a black bastard before he made him a ghost." Someone gasped audibly. Brent's attorney put a hand on his shoulder, but Brent shrugged it off, his pride too stupid to realize it had already drowned. Camille turned toward the jury. "This isn't about one man anymore. This is about a system that heard those words and kept him employed. A department that watched that footage and decided it was training, not hate. You don't just convict Brent Halverson. You convict everything that let him get this far." Brent's voice finally returned, cracked and shaky. "You think you're righteous? You think this makes you a hero?" Camille didn't answer him. She turned back to the judge. "I rest my statement," and sat down. The judge looked over the courtroom, then at the defense. "Do you have a rebuttal?" Brent's attorney, visibly sweating, whispered something in his ear. Brent shook his head, eyes wide. "I'm not apologizing," he muttered, too loudly. "They set me up." No one responded, because by then it was too late. The damage was done. His words had played across national television. The news networks clipped it within minutes. Social media roared, memes, headlines, outrage. The phrase "black bastards" became a trending hashtag attached to his name. Former cadets began anonymously submitting complaints. Investigative reports reopened. A retired officer admitted Brandt had used racial slurs before, but no one had taken it seriously. Till now, outside the courthouse, the crowd was no longer just protesters. They were witnesses. Some shouted, some chanted, but all of them had one thing in common. They had seen behind the uniform, and what they saw was rot. Wallace stood in the hallway, watching through the glass as Brent hunched at the defense table. He didn't smile. He didn't feel satisfied. What he felt was cold. The kind of cold you get when a mask finally peels off and all that's underneath is as pathetic as it is poisonous. Camille exited the courtroom and walked directly past the cameras. They shouted her name. She didn't stop. Someone asked, "Do you want him to go to jail?" She paused, turned, and said simply, "I want him to walk this country knowing he will never be unseen again." And that was it. The press, the people, even the judge, none of them would forget this moment. Brent wasn't a former cop anymore. He was a walking monument to disgrace. And Camille? She had turned the trial into a mirror, and the country finally saw what it had been ignoring for far too long. The weight of the courtroom silence from the previous day lingered in the air like smoke after gunfire. Camille stood tall, as if she had never known the word fear, her expression unreadable, her presence a blade honed by loss and vengeance. She carried no weapons, but every step she took was a wound deepening in the conscience of those who had looked away for too long. The judge called the next exhibit without ceremony. There was no need. Everyone in the room understood that what came next would be less about evidence and more about indictment of the man, the system, and the silence that enabled them both. Camille approached the bench and handed over a folder. It was unassuming, gray, thin, marked only with a reference number. But the moment it touched the clerk's hands, a chill swept through the courtroom like someone had opened a door to a morgue. Inside the folder were disciplinary records from Brent Halverson's department, previously sealed. Redacted copies had been leaked weeks earlier, but what Camille had now was unredacted, signed, time-stamped, and deadly. Among them was a report of temporary suspension for internal assault, an altercation with a junior officer that ended with a broken wrist, and a silenced complaint. The filing was dated 2018, and in the margins, in faded pen, was Wallace Kim's signature. Camille didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The truth had already done the screaming. "This is your hero," she said, turning slowly to the jury, her voice velvet wrapped around iron. "This is the man who pointed a gun at my husband and saw a threat, not because of what he did, but because of what he looked like. The same man who broke another officer's wrist and called it a misunderstanding, and the department, the institution you trusted, buried it like it was nothing more than a paper cut." Brent's attorney leapt to his feet, his voice shrill with desperation. "Your Honor, these records were obtained through unauthorized channels." Camille cut in without moving an inch. "No, Counselor. These records were buried through authorized cowardice. And now they're exactly where they belong, under the light." The judge glanced at the documents, then nodded solemnly. Admissible. There was no wriggling away from this. Brent shifted in his seat, that ever-present smirk faltering under the weight of his past. His hand moved to adjust his collar, fingers trembling slightly. Camille didn't stop. "You don't get to shoot a man and erase your past in the same breath," she said, eyes locking onto Brent's like crosshairs. "You don't get to wave a badge and pretend it came without blood. You don't get to act like this courtroom is your redemption. It isn't. It's your mirror." Brent's voice came, dry and thin. "You're playing morality games. That's all this is. You want to be the righteous one." Camille turned, not toward him, but toward the audience, letting the weight of his words fill the space like gas waiting for a spark. "No," she replied coldly. "I'm building a grave for your arrogance. Out of every report you thought no one would read, every bruise you caused behind closed doors, every time someone said, 'Don't rock the boat,' and stapled their mouths shut. I'm building that grave in public. And when this trial ends, your name will never walk clean again." Wallace sat at the far end of the defense table, his face pale, his hands buried in each other like he could wring guilt out of his skin. He hadn't looked up once. Not when the documents were read aloud, not when Camille called out his complicity, not when Brent spoke. He was no longer a witness, he was an echo of silence, trying to become a man again. The air in the courtroom thickened, not with noise, but with tension so sharp it felt like breathing was treason. No one moved, no one spoke, not even the stenographer, whose fingers hovered above the keys as if afraid that typing the words might summon something irreversible. Camille took her seat, not because she was done, but because Brent was. The judge turned to the defense. "Do you wish to cross-examine?" Brent's lawyer hesitated. "No, Your Honor. We waive." The judge nodded, the lines in his face a roadmap of everything he had witnessed and could never unsee. Camille didn't smile. That wasn't her victory. Not yet. But she let her hand drift to the edge of the table, fingertips brushing the edge, like she was steadying herself against an old wound. Outside, the news vans were already repositioning. The anchors are prepping their next soundbite. But inside that courtroom, the most important sound was Brent's silence and the unmistakable trembling in his hands. Because now, he wasn't the man with the gun. He was the man whose past had crawled out of its grave and wrapped itself around his throat. And Camille? She didn't just survive him, she dismantled him. The courtroom buzzed with a tense hush, a static pressure that seemed to weigh on every collarbone in the room. Brent Halverson stood, trembling slightly at first, then with more visible urgency, as if every bone in his body was screaming to flee. His eyes darted between the gallery, the judge, and Camille, who had not moved from her place since the last volley of damning evidence. The bailiff stepped forward just as Brent made a motion to gather his files, voice flat and mechanical. "Mr. Halverson, you are not permitted to leave. Your continued presence is required for the remainder of this proceeding." Brent exhaled sharply, a laugh twisted with disbelief, but the cold gleam in his eyes had dulled. He looked like a dog realizing the fence was electrified on all sides. Camille stood slowly, as if she had been waiting for this exact second. She didn't rush, didn't storm. She approached the bench with the kind of gravity that turned every eye her way without command. With one hand, she pulled a USB drive from her jacket pocket, and with the other, she held up a notarized transcript. The judge raised an eyebrow. "This was submitted for verification this morning, Your Honor," she said. Her voice was steady, sharpened steel. "It's footage from a patrol car dashcam. Dated 3 months prior, it shows Officer Halverson accepting a bribe from a suspect in a narcotics case. Money in hand, pocketed, in exchange for resolving the matter off the record." The judge nodded to the tech clerk. The screen lit up behind the witness stand. The room fell silent. Then the clip played. There was Brent, leaning against a cruiser, his hand casually extended. A small envelope exchanged hands. The audio crackled, clear and undeniable. "Don't worry, man," Brent's voice hissed, oily with confidence. "You're clean as long as I say you're clean." The moment felt endless. When the clip ended, Brent didn't speak. His mouth opened slightly, then shut again. His hands, resting on the desk, curled into shaking fists. Camille stepped to the center of the courtroom. She didn't face Brent. She didn't need to. Her voice aimed directly at the gallery, where journalists had their cameras lifted like weapons. "You want to know who he is?" she asked, her tone rising, not with rage but with righteous force. "He's not just a man who killed my husband. He's not just a man who lied under oath. He's a man who sold off justice by the ounce, cut deals in alleys, while pretending to wear honor on his chest." She turned, eyes cutting to the camera lens. "So I ask everyone watching, how many of you have lost a friend, a brother, a father, to the silence bought with his handshake? How many of us were never protected, only priced?" There was no sound from Brent now. Even the smug mask he'd once worn had melted away, revealing the sweat behind the arrogance, the smallness behind the badge. The judge adjusted his glasses, saying nothing. Wallace, seated at the far end, no longer pretended to be elsewhere. He was here in the middle of it, and he looked like he wanted to vomit. Camille lowered her voice, almost a whisper, but it carried like thunder. Justice doesn't rot in the dark. It rots in the daylight. When people see men like this and choose to look away. A single reporter near the back blinked into tears. Another began typing furiously. Then, like an executioner without a blade, she turned and walked back to her seat. No drama, no victory pose, just that silent recoil of power, the kind that doesn't scream because it never needed to. By the end of the day, the hashtag #SoldJustice was trending in 20 states. The courtroom sketch of Camille pointing at Brent like a mirror had already gone viral. The internet had taken her grief and weaponized it into a reckoning. People didn't just want justice now. They wanted to tear down the scaffolding that allowed men like Brent to climb in the first place. And Brent, once the man with a badge and a smirk, now looked like a stranded prisoner, pinned not by steel bars, but by a truth too loud to ignore. Camille had spoken, the court had heard, but it was the people who were now echoing her voice, and Brent, for the first time, realized he couldn't outtalk the roar. The room had barely caught its breath from Camille's last blow when she made her next move, not with fanfare, but with frightening precision. As the court clerk called her name and gestured toward the witness box, she did not budge. Instead, Camille walked slowly, purposefully to the center of the room, dragging a chair behind her across the polished floor with the scrape of steel against marble that sliced the silence in two. She placed the chair midway between the judge's bench and the gallery where the people sat, where the truth now lived. A murmur rippled through the crowd, not out of confusion but awe. Camille didn't ask for permission. She didn't need it. The judge raised a brow but did not object. She sat, back straight, hands resting calmly on her knees, her chin tilted ever so slightly upward. No badge adorned her chest, no official seal protected her, but power radiated from her posture like heat from scorched stone. Brent let out a barking laugh, dry and forced like metal grinding against bone. You think this is a performance? You're not special. You're a woman with a sob story and a grudge. She didn't turn to him. Her voice cut through the air without rising. I am the person you should have lowered your eyes to the moment you saw me, but you couldn't, could you? You were too busy polishing your cowardice and stapling it behind a badge. Wallace flinched as if slapped. He blinked rapidly, trying to contain the sheen of moisture gathering at the edge of his eyes. For the first time, his mask cracked, not from pressure, but recognition. The whole courtroom seemed suspended, caught in the gravity of Camille's presence. She wasn't a witness. She was an indictment. Camille turned toward the judge now, not with deference, but certainty. This chair, she said, tapping the armrest, is not for storytelling. It is for truth-telling. I am not here as a victim. I am here as an indictment of a system that licenses predators and punishes silence. From the press row, cameras clicked in rapid bursts, capturing the unmistakable image, a black woman sitting dead center in the court, daring the walls to speak back. Her presence dared the law to contradict her, dared the people to look away. It was no longer about one bullet, one officer, or one husband. It was about every silent policy, every ignored file, every unchecked ego, dressed in a uniform. Brent shifted in his seat. His face, once smug, now tensed with the twitch of a man who felt his grip slipping. He reached for his water but knocked it over, a thin stream spilling across the desk toward the folder of his sanitized defense. Wallace didn't offer help. Camille didn't blink. You built careers on silence. I built scars on survival. Today, I speak louder than your years of pretending. The judge cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable but saying nothing. The law, on paper, was above emotion, but in that room the emotion was law. A woman in the gallery whispered, "She's not testifying, she's leading." Camille tilted her head slightly in acknowledgement, catching the whisper like a prayer. Then she reached into her coat and retrieved a printed copy of Brent's past incident reports, documents sealed, buried, and scrubbed clean by favors. She read them aloud, one by one, not with outrage, but with the surgical cadence of someone performing an autopsy on a lie. June 2018, use of excessive force against a suspect already restrained. No body cam footage submitted. No follow-up interview conducted. Brent clenched his jaw. A vein pulsed at his temple. October 2019. Verbal abuse during a routine traffic stop. The complaint filed anonymously. No disciplinary action pursued. She looked up. This is not a pattern. This is a practice. This is what happens when you confuse wearing a badge with earning one. Her voice never cracked, never shouted. That was the terror in it, its control. She didn't have to scream to bring the roof down. She just told the truth and let the room shudder around it. Brent finally stood, knuckles white as he gripped the desk. This is character assassination. Camille turned, cool as shadow. No, this is character exposure. Assassination would have required a weapon. I brought nothing but your history. The judge gestured for order, but the room wasn't unruly. It was reverent. Even reporters had stopped typing, watching, as if afraid to miss a single flicker of expression across Camille's face. Wallace's voice broke through the stillness, hoarse and threadbare. She's not here to punish us. She's here to remind us we were never untouchable. Camille glanced at him, not with forgiveness, but with finality. And your reminder will come every time a mirror doesn't lie. She stood, not waiting for permission, not needing a cue. The chair remained where it was, a new landmark in a courtroom that would never feel the same again. As she walked past Brent, he flinched, not because she looked at him, but because she didn't. The worst fear of men like him was always irrelevant. That day, the court didn't recess. It paused, suspended in the wake of a woman who rewrote the rules, not by shouting over them, but by refusing to obey them. Camille didn't need to raise her fist. She just needed to sit where she wasn't supposed to and make it impossible for anyone to forget it. The camera lens captured Wallace Kim in unflinching clarity. No shadows to hide behind, no badge to polish. The air in the studio was brittle, stiff with anticipation as he adjusted the collar of a plain white shirt that suddenly felt too tight for the weight he was about to drop. He looked older now, not from time, but from something corrosive that had eaten through him from within. The confession began not with an apology, but with a breath that shook like a building losing its foundation. I helped him, Wallace said, his voice dry and stripped bare. I backed a man who never deserved the authority we handed him. I let fear be my compass. I let silence be my partner. The host didn't interrupt. The studio team didn't cut. The country watched. I altered reports. I looked the other way. I justified things in my head that no man with children of his own should justify. Brant Halverson should have been in handcuffs a long time ago, and I helped keep those cuffs off him. The admission didn't come with tears. It came with a hollow that echoed deeper than any emotion could fill. For a moment, Wallace didn't speak. His lips tightened. His hands clenched on the table. When he finally spoke again, the words crawled out of a place far darker than guilt. Camille Raines didn't break me. She just held up the mirror. The host leaned in. And what do you see now? Wallace didn't blink. A man who no longer wants to lie to his son about what justice looks like. The live broadcast cut to a prepared video Camille had sent earlier. No special effects. No sound score. Just her face, framed in steady light, looking directly at the lens. She wore no makeup, no uniform. Her voice was soft, too soft to be mistaken for weakness. I'm not here to thank you, Mr. Kim. That's not what truth is for. I don't owe you closure, and you don't deserve peace. She paused. Not for drama or wait. I only hope your son learns how to apologize, and not the way you just did. Too late, too loud, and only when the world's already watching. The clip ended. No logo, no fade out, just silence. In homes across the country, people stared at their screens, stunned not by theatrics, but by the cold, unsparing gravity of it all. This wasn't redemption. It was a reckoning that left its mark like frostbite, quiet, sharp, and irreversible. Behind the cameras, a producer muttered, "He's not walking this back." The host nodded. No, He's not. Wallace rose from the chair, his body heavier than when he'd walked in. Outside the studio, protesters no longer shouted his name. They whispered it, like a ghost's, like something already buried. Camille hadn't just exposed a man. She had dragged the rot of complicity into daylight, forced it to stand on its own two trembling feet. Wallace knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a sentence that had no period. Only commas, only breathless pauses before the next time someone asked, "Why didn't you stop him?" And he would have to answer again. Camille, somewhere unseen, folded the transcript of his confession without flinching. She didn't smile, didn't nod. Justice wasn't a performance. It was a scar you learned to wear without apology. She poured herself a glass of water. No wine, no toast, just the sound of glass hitting the counter. She didn't believe in happy endings, only in earned ones. Wallace Kim would never earn one. Not in this lifetime, not with what he helped bury, not with the lives shredded under his silence. He could write statements, speak on stages, sign petitions, but the dead had no pen to co-sign his redemption. Camille didn't need him punished. She needed him to be haunted, and now he was. The broadcast of Wallace's confession had not even cooled before the city square outside the courthouse ignited with humanity. They came with signs, not torches. Not chants of revenge, but slogans of reckoning. Across the barricades and beneath balconies, the words "Widow General" echoed like an anthem. It was no longer Camille Raines alone. It was a movement cloaked in the silhouette of her silence. One voice cut through the static, a man in work boots and a hoodie, shouting with trembling rage. "She bled in Mosul, and her husband bled on Main Street. Is that the American promise?" Cameras snapped. Reporters turned, but Camille was nowhere on the ground. Instead, she stood on the roof of the federal building adjacent to the courthouse. The wind pressed against her old military uniform, sleeves rolled, chest squared, back straight, as if she were standing before a firing line again. But there was no rifle in her grip this time, only the meticulously folded American flag she had refused to surrender to despair. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her posture alone silenced the crowd more effectively than 1,000 closing arguments. Brent Halverson, cuffed at the wrists and flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals, was led down the front steps. His face had no smirk left to cling to. Sweat pooled at his collar, his eyes darting, seeking sanctuary in a city that had turned its spine to him. The silence that hung between Camille and Brent was not empty, it was volcanic. It brimmed with every name, every case, every bullet filed away and misclassified as policy. As Brent passed below her, his gaze was yanked upward by something more primal than fear. It was recognition. Recognition that she was not a headline. She was not even a threat. She was a consequence in human form. His step faltered for a moment. He might have spoken, but Camille tilted her head, just enough, as if dissecting his cowardice one last time, before sealing it in the coffin of public memory. The new police chief, a woman of hard-earned restraint, stepped before a podium surrounded by journalists. Her voice, though practiced, cracked on the edges. "The department failed, I failed, and I apologize." It was the first time someone in uniform had admitted that in the history of this town. Reporters leaned in, catching every syllable as if it were oxygen. Yet Camille didn't flinch, didn't turn. She stayed on that rooftop, her shadow carving through the afternoon sun like a permanent fault line. In the courtroom behind her, the proceedings had stalled. Judges, lawyers, bailiffs, everyone paused, eyes fixed on monitors replaying the rooftop standoff in real time. Brent's attorney whispered desperately, "We need a recess." The judge replied without looking up, "You're already in one. She gave it to you." Outside, protesters held up portraits of victims past and present, not just of Camille's husband, but of every face that had once been shrugged off as unfortunate. Students from the local university painted murals of Camille as Athena, battle-worn and unyielding. Graffiti bloomed like declarations across brick walls. "Justice wears boots. Truth doesn't need a badge. Widow General rises. But Camille remained unmoved. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. Her stillness had become language, and the crowd had learned to read it fluently. She was the last page of a report no one dared to write. Until now, no victim, no hero, no martyr, just the immovable center of a moral equation finally balanced by exposure. As the marshals loaded Brent into the van, someone in the crowd spat in his direction. He flinched but said nothing. No curses, no rebuttals. For the first time, he was no longer the hunter. He was just a man in chains, watched by thousands, reduced to a parable. Wallace stood at the fringe of the scene, eyes hollow, knowing Camille would never look in his direction again. She didn't need to. He had become a footnote in a story that had already outgrown him. Above it all, the sky began to turn. Not dark, but golden, the way things look just before night decides whether to fall or fight. The flag in Camille's arms didn't flutter. It waited, as she did, for history to decide what came next. She turned slowly, finally, not toward the courthouse or the cameras, but toward a new direction, one no one could trace. The rooftop door clicked shut behind her, and though the crowd stayed and the signs waved, everyone knew something final had happened. Camille had not descended. She had risen past them all. The room wasn't built for echoes, but when Camille Raines stepped into the chamber of the United States Congress, every footstep she made reverberated like a sentence being handed down. She didn't wear her uniform. She didn't carry her folded flag. There were no medals on her chest, no entourage trailing behind her, just a black folder, a rolled-up map, and a face that had learned how to hold grief without breaking. The chamber, packed with power and tailored suits and polite silence, braced for a speech. But Camille didn't bring speeches. She brought clarity. No greetings, no acknowledgments, no preamble. She reached the witness table, unrolled the map with the precision of a sniper unfolding a mission brief, smoothing each edge deliberately. It was a detailed topographic map of the United States, but not the one used in classrooms. 24 red circles bled across it, each marked with a date, a department, and a name. Officer-involved shootings, each one was labeled accidental, inclusive, or administratively resolved. All of them shared one thing. The bullet went in, and the system folded back on itself like a snake swallowing its tail. I was told to summarize my testimony in under 5 minutes, she said flatly, not even reaching for the mic. Her voice didn't need help. That should be enough, assuming no one here intends to pretend they haven't already read the file. There was no rustle, no throat clearing, no polite interruption, only that kind of stillness found in cemeteries, where the air itself chooses not to move. She raised her right hand, not for an oath, but to show a scar running down her palm, deep and crooked. "I don't come here to ask for justice," she said. "Justice doesn't take this long. Justice doesn't arrive after the cameras are cleaned and the PR statements rehearsed. I come here to make a sound. The sound you will hear the day these 24 names become 40 or 60 or 100, because they will. Because silence is not neutral, it's complicit." One senator shifted in his chair, the pen in his hand slipping slightly. Another leaned forward, elbows stiff. But Camille kept her posture still, hands low, shoulders even. She pulled a page from the folder, her husband's autopsy report. Then another, a photograph of his blood-soaked shirt. She set them beside the map like one lays down cards, not for chance, but to expose a rigged deck. "My husband bent down to find his ID," she said, voice tight. A badge told the world he was a threat. That badge is still active in 24 other departments. That badge had a brotherhood. That badge had silence. But silence is not peace. It is just noise that pretends it isn't violence. She took one breath, not to steady herself, but to slow the room. "I'm not asking for laws. You'll make them, you'll break them. I'm not asking for reform. You'll fund it, shelve it, forget it. I'm asking for presence. When a mother knocks on your office door holding a folded death certificate, don't quote her procedure. Don't ask if the suspect reached. Don't ask if the footage is clear. Sit down. Open the file. Say the name. Let it ring in your teeth. Let it keep you awake. Let it follow you home. Still, no one moved. No pens scratched. The map now looked like a body itself, veins running red. Camille's presence filled the air like gunpowder waiting for heat. I don't need you to kneel, she continued. I need you to stand, like I did, with nothing but truth in one hand and blood in the other. I need you to stop asking what made them die and start asking what made you look away. She picked up her folder, folded the map carefully. Her hands didn't tremble. They hadn't been in court. They hadn't been in combat. They wouldn't know. But before she walked toward the exit, she stopped, just a few degrees turned toward the room. This isn't my fight anymore, she said. It's yours. Let's see how you hold it. The moment she exited, the room exhaled. It had forgotten how to breathe while she spoke. No one stood. No one clapped. But they all heard it. That sound she warned them of. Not her voice, not the camera clicks. The sound of accountability, cracking the veneer of a room built to deflect it. That afternoon, headlines exploded. Widow General silences Congress. A testimony sharper than any indictment, one columnist wrote. Another called it the Ferguson Reckoning, 5 years overdue. Cable anchors replayed her closing line on loop, but Camille didn't appear on any shows. She didn't answer calls. She wasn't in any hotel. She was home, cross-legged on the floor, replaying the hearing not to hear herself, but to watch who flinched. That was how she measured progress now. Reflexes, not promises. Somewhere between the broadcast and the echo, a staffer printed a list of those 24 departments. Another opened the budgets. Another checked the names against voter rolls. It had begun, not because she demanded it, but because she didn't need to. By the following morning, Camille's name wasn't trending. Her presence was. Not a hashtag, not a movement, a presence. The kind that settled in rooms uninvited. The kind that made every police union spokesman double-check their words. It wasn't about heroism. It wasn't martyrdom. It was the burden of a system forced to see its reflection through the eyes of someone it could not destroy. Editorials poured in, but they all circled one gravity well. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She indicated with composure. Senators who had rolled their eyes in closed meetings now leaned in during hearings about police reform, speaking slower, more cautiously. Journalists revisited old cases with new angles. Angles shaped like red circles on maps. At a cafe 2 blocks from the Capitol, 2 interns whispered over burnt coffee. She said we don't need laws, one muttered. But we do. The other shook his head. She said laws aren't the answer. Not if no one holds the people who write them accountable. In a police station 4 states away, a captain stared at the memo on his desk. It was a formal request to review his department's record of officer-involved shootings. Anonymous, but stamped with one phrase in black ink, red dot watch list. Meanwhile, Camille remained unreachable. She was seen briefly at a veterans cemetery, alone, standing before a grave that wasn't her husband's. No flowers, just a coin pressed into the stone, a soldier's way of saying, I was here, I remember. The ripples didn't just reach law enforcement. School boards began receiving calls from parents demanding that civil rights history be made mandatory starting in grade 6. A mayor in Illinois ordered a full audit of misconduct settlements made over the last decade. One news anchor, visibly shaken, ended his segment by reading all 24 names Camille had circled. It wasn't ratings, it was reckoning. And still, Camille did not return to the spotlight, but her absence became its form of testimony that someone so composed, so pointed, could walk into the heart of legislative power, speak truth, and walk out without asking for a single thing. That was the loudest alarm the system had heard in years. A former federal judge was quoted as saying, "She brought no demands, yet left us with obligations." In that same interview, he added, "She made it impossible to pretend we don't see what we've normalized." The Department of Justice quietly opened internal reviews on 2 of the precincts she highlighted. No press releases, just movement, not out of guilt, but fear of exposure. They weren't afraid of protest. They were afraid of her kind of calm, the kind that made excuses obsolete. And Brent, his name had vanished from police rolls, but not from the public record. Every time a city council met to discuss law enforcement funding, someone brought him up. Let's not create another Brent Halverson. It became a phrase, a cautionary tale, a professional stain that could not be expunged. His face, once red with rage, later pale with humiliation, was now printed on pamphlets handed out by justice reform groups, not to condemn, but to educate. "This is what unaccountable power looks like," the caption read. "This is how it breaks." Wallace, too, found himself pushed out of public memory, not erased, but shelved in the cold drawer of complicity. A few stations ran his confession clip again, but it didn't go viral. It wasn't sharp enough. It wasn't a fire. It was the smoke after something had already burned. Yet Camille never said his name again. She didn't have to. One evening, as autumn folded over D.C. like a worn flag, a young woman in fatigues stood in line outside a town hall forum. She held a copy of the now famous congressional testimony and wore a patch, Ghost 6. A volunteer asked her if she had questions for the panel. She said no questions, just reminders. That was the shift. Camille hadn't created a new system. She had shattered the illusion that the old one could survive untouched. The echo hadn't just moved through people. It now lived in them. Camille's absence had become a kind of doctrine. Networks tried to chase her down, offering prime-time exclusives, 7-figure book deals, and full podcast series. She refused them all with one line sent through her attorney. "I didn't do this for attention. I did it because I could." And then she disappeared again, not into hiding, but into deliberate invisibility, letting the truth echo louder in the vacuum she left behind. That vacuum didn't stay empty for long. In towns across the country, citizens began rolling out maps of their own, circling incidents with red pens. Some towns saw 3 dots, others 9. In one particularly gutted city precinct, someone painted a mural, a silhouette of Camille standing beside a casket-shaped flag, 1 foot planted on a broken badge. Above it, the words, "We were trained to survive, not to stay silent." At universities, law professors dissected Camille's testimony like case law. In a graduate seminar at Yale, one student asked, "How did she get them to listen without demanding anything?" The professor answered, "She didn't just hold the system accountable. She made everyone in it look inward and see whether they deserved to be part of it." Meanwhile, the officers who once laughed at Brent's jokes now refused to speak his name. A few resigned. Some testified anonymously to internal affairs. One even left his badge at a protest site, taped to a handwritten note. "This thing didn't weigh a thing until now. Now I can't breathe wearing it." And Brent, he hadn't spoken since the day Camille watched him being let out in cuffs. His legal team dissolved after the last recorded call leaked. Him begging to get in front of this with a sobbing voice, not of remorse, but panic. A plea not to be judged, but to be forgotten. The internet wouldn't let him. His face had become the unshakable symbol of an unchecked trigger finger. Memes spread with captions like, "This is why she stood higher." Even when he tried to resurface under a new name, someone would always recognize his eyes, the same ones that once narrowed in arrogance, now wide with fear. And still, Camille said nothing. That silence had weight, heavier than condemnation, more brutal than vengeance. It made his story a monologue, one no one listened to, because the audience had already changed the channel. By the 3rd week after the hearing, grassroots organizations adopted Camille's map model. They called it the Red Dot Index, publicly searchable, community-sourced. Every red circle was accompanied by a link to documents, eyewitness accounts, and a banner that read, "Not forgotten, not forgiven." A few state legislatures attempted to block access, citing privacy concerns, but every time they tried, the site went more viral. The Justice Department, quiet until now, sent representatives to 20 different precincts named in Camille's testimony. No media, no statements, just files, files, files. Camille had forced their hand without raising her voice. not because they feared her, but because she made their inaction look like negligence wrapped in bureaucracy. At a protest in Sacramento, a child sat on her father's shoulders, holding a cardboard sign. It said, "I want to grow up with rules that work both ways." Camille's influence had become generational. In a small town in Tennessee, an elderly black veteran stood at a town hall meeting, holding up a printout of Camille's testimony. "I fought overseas and came back to a country that told me to keep my head down. This woman, she kept hers up, so we didn't have to flinch anymore." Meanwhile, Brent's trial was postponed due to security concerns. His legal counsel shrank to a lone, overworked public defender who had once interned under a civil rights litigator. When asked off the record why he took the case, the man simply replied, "Because I want to know what he looks like when he realizes no one's afraid of him anymore." Inside the Department of Defense, an internal memo leaked. Go 6 had officially been declassified. Camille's name had been redacted in every version, but someone had scribbled in pen, "She doesn't need us to validate her. We need to be worthy of what she survived." And still, no interview, no tweet, no rally. Just Camille, seated alone at a folding table in a community center in Baltimore, handing out voter registration forms. A volunteer whispered, "You could be in front of 1,000 cameras right now." Camille handed the next form to a woman holding her toddler. "I'm in front of the right ones." The 4th week passed. Camille did not appear on screens, but her face, serene, uncompromising, hung on the walls of courtrooms, libraries, and bus stops, not because anyone put it there for fame, but because people had started to need her there. She had become a fixed point in a world constantly slipping its moral compass. The Senate Judiciary Committee issued a rare emergency session to address the public pressure. Cameras flashed. Every chair was filled, but it wasn't the senators who people watched. It was the empty seat reserved for Camille, still untouched. She had declined the invitation. No statement, just a response through her attorney. "I testified once, that was enough. You know what needs to be done." The room felt colder after that. No longer was the trial about Brent Halverson alone. It had evolved into a referendum on a system too long allowed itself to shield itself in silence. Camille's voice had triggered something far larger, an unraveling not of one man's crime, but of a culture that allowed it to be possible, repeated, forgotten. In precincts across the country, internal files were no longer whispers. They were whistle-blown. Officers who once mocked reform now took paid leave, not out of protest, but panic. One captain, retired, confessed on live radio, "We all knew guys like Brent. Hell, we protected them, because the system asked for order, not integrity." Even the term "widow general," once coined to praise Camille's strength, began taking on a larger meaning. It no longer described her alone. It became a title worn by survivors of silence. People who had lost not just to bullets, but to erasure, dismissal, the slow choke of systemic neglect. And Camille? She was last seen in a courtroom, not as a witness or plaintiff, but seated quietly in the back row, observing a local eviction hearing. A reporter asked her why. She responded, "Because some injustice happens in daylight, some in the shadows. Both need eyes." By now, law schools had rewritten curriculum modules to include the Camille doctrine, not just her case, but the sequence of her resistance: calm, strategic, public, without spectacle. The doctrine emphasized two ideas: truth doesn't need a microphone to shake the room, and not every hero arrives to be thanked. Brent's defense team submitted a plea bargain. It was rejected. The prosecution brought forward 3 additional victims from unrelated abuse cases tied to Brent, now emboldened by Camille's testimony. The courtroom did not gasp. It did not cheer. It listened. The era of reaction had ended. This was the age of reckoning. At the steps of the same courthouse, a small crowd gathered, not to protest, not to shout, but to stand, silent, holding signs that bore no slogans, just names. One woman held a sign with a single sentence, "Because she didn't stop where others broke." Wallace, now a forgotten thread in this tapestry, was reported to have taken up work with a nonprofit focusing on ethical training for law enforcement. Camille never acknowledged it. The nation didn't reward him. That chapter had closed with no applause. Weeks later, a journalist ran a story headlined, "The Woman Who Didn't Burn It Down." She turned on the lights. It spread. It stayed. Not because it was catchy, but because it was true. In a coffee shop in Phoenix, a barista corrected a customer who mispronounced her name. "It's not Cammy, it's Camille," she said, like the woman who made the country listen. Somewhere in Louisiana, a retired Marine scrolled through his phone, saw an image of Camille standing before Congress, and muttered, "Semper Fi," then deleted the post. Not out of disrespect, but reverence. It didn't belong on a feed. It belonged in the marrow. And in D.C., a child's voice rang out during a mock hearing staged for students. When asked who she wanted to be when she grew up, she didn't say president. She didn't say doctor. She said, "I want to be like the lady who made them stop lying." That was Camille's justice. Not loud, not fast, but thorough, enduring. She didn't need to walk back into the chamber. She had never really left. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. No headlines, no guards, no flowers. Just a pair of boots, worn but clean, stepping through grass still wet from morning dew. The cemetery was silent, save for the distant hum of wind against flagpoles and the occasional sigh of a world too used to burying the brave. Camille walked alone, and that was exactly how it needed to be. She reached the stone simple, unadorned, no grand words, just a name and 2 dates, too close together. The flag he'd earned lay folded beneath a piece of clear acrylic, already beginning to fade from the sun. She stood there for a long while, saying nothing, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the weight of everything she had said already lived in echoes too loud for speech. Then, slowly, she unfolded a piece of paper, handwritten, creased and recreased, ink faded at the edges like it had been touched too many times, held too close on nights too quiet. Her voice, when it came, was low, but steady. "You once told me if I stayed quiet, the world might be more peaceful, that people like me were better off blending in, that I had earned rest, not more battles." She looked down, then up again. But there was an anti-war protest outside, and it chose to wake the world up. And it turns out, peace without truth isn't peace. It's anesthesia. The paper fluttered in her hand for a moment longer. Then she struck a match. The flame caught fast, curling black edges inward, devouring each word without permission. She let it fall from her fingers. The ashes danced, then settled, scattering across the folded flag like a whisper being swallowed whole. Camille didn't cry. Her eyes were dry, not from numbness, but from having seen too much to waste tears where resolve was needed. As she turned to leave, the quiet wasn't heavy anymore. It was earned. She had taken 12 steps down the path before she heard the softest patter of sneakers behind her. A voice, high and unsure, called out, "Are you the lady from the TV?" Camille turned. A little black girl stood at the edge of the pathway, small hands gripping the straps of a faded purple backpack. She looked up, curious, not in awe, but in recognition, like someone who'd been told stories and finally met the proof. Camille crouched to her level, no smile, just clarity. "No, sweetheart," she said. "I'm not someone from the TV. I'm someone who made sure what happened to my husband never gets to happen to yours." The girl blinked. Camille brushed a curl from the child's forehead, then stood. She didn't ask the girl's name. She didn't need to. She had already carried it. Along with every other name, no one else had spoken until now. As she walked away, she didn't look back. Some stories don't close with applause. They end with footsteps, moving forward. And sometimes that's the loudest ending of all.